Hi, I'm Larry Lieberman. Welcome back to the .NET Conference. Today I'm going to talk to you about Universal Windows Apps in XAML. We have an online chat going on at the same time, so you are able to submit your questions as we go, I believe, and they'll get vetted for me and I'll be able to see them up here on the screen. First, a little bit about me. I'm a product manager here at Microsoft focused on the developer ecosystem. I've been working on platforms at Microsoft for about 15 years, specifically in the mobile space for about 10 years, and then obviously with Windows Phone for the last 5. We've been focusing on Windows Phone, now Windows and Windows Phone. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today has to do with what are universal Windows apps and what does this mean for you as a developer. I've got some contact information here as well that you'll be able to use later on if you want to contact me. So what are we talking about here? Specifically, I'm going to talk about what it means that we've converged these platforms, Windows and Windows Phone. I'm going to talk about what universal Windows apps are, what it means for you as the developer. And I'm going to talk about portable class libraries as well. And at the end, we'll start talking a little bit about what other types of code sharing strategies there are that will be relevant for you. And there's some resources at the end of this deck as well. Now, people work across phone, tablets, and PCs. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. This is very obvious. We all have multiple devices these days. We have notebook, laptop computers. We've got tablet devices. This is an 8-inch Windows tablet. We've got phones. We've got big phones like this Nokia 1520. We've got small phones. We've got a whole wide array of different types of devices out there. And people want to use those devices, and they want to experience their software across those devices. And you as a developer want to be able to build application experiences that exist across those different types of devices. Well, what we've done in this release, and we announced this back in April at Build, but I'm going to be going in depth for you today around universal Windows apps. What do we mean when we talk about universal Windows apps? Well, obviously, from an end user perspective, what this means is that I can have an application experience and I can experience that application experience on all my different devices. Now, one key thing to note here, obviously, the experience needs to be tailored appropriately for the device form factor. And historically, that's meant a tremendous amount of work for you as a developer. So we stepped back and asked ourselves, what do we need to do in order to maximize the amount of reuse for you, the developer? What do we do to minimize the amount of work necessary to target all of these platforms? That's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Before I do that, really quick, I actually want to answer these questions real time because then they won't stack up. We've got a question here. When is support for VB.NET and Universal Apps going to be released? We actually have support in VB.NET for Universal Apps today. It just doesn't necessarily have the full exposure in Visual Studio. When you go into Visual Studio Universal Solutions, which we'll talk about in a minute, you won't see the Universal Store App solution for VB.NET, but there is a way to do it. And I'll talk to that point when I get there. There's been a number of blog posts on the VB blog on MSDN that you can get to that actually just go through. If you search on Bing for VB and Universal Windows Store Apps, you should be able to find it. But we'll talk about it too here as we go. Okay, with that aside, look, what does development entail? Software development isn't just about building a user interface. And it's not just about writing applications that leverage a specific type of application model or using certain APIs or the tools even. Like you also have to publish the app. So there's all these different pieces at play. And every single aspect of them has an impact on the amount of work that you as a developer have to do. Question here from Atul Kumar. Wild question. Any plans for Universal Apps World to include Android and iPhones also? Well, I'm not going to speak to that exactly right this minute, but the answer is that there are other people doing cross-platform work in this space, and we certainly are going to be working with those other folks, those third parties, on trying to make all the benefits that we've provided here available in the context of writing applications for third-party platforms, for other platforms as well. So the answer is that there are third parties who have built stuff in this space. Xamarin's a big one of them, obviously. We will continue to work with these partners to try to provide all the benefits that we have to them as well, but nothing to announce at this time. Another question here, Rob S. When will Universal Apps be supported on Xbox? We announced that we are going to be bringing this. We showed it at Build, but we don't have a date to announce yet, unfortunately. So, sorry, Rob. Let's keep going then. Now, when you build experiences, you can adapt a design across those device types. You can or you can go further and tailor that design across those device types. And what I'm going to show you today is basically how we've enabled you to do these things. We actually have basically, and we're going to focus on XAML right now. Universal apps are available for more than just XAML programming. But if you are building applications with XAML and you use good responsive design principles, you can actually leverage one single UI that paints appropriately across the different device types. That's sort of a rudimentary example there in the picture of Paint for Kids. But you can also build tailored experiences. We enable you with our Universal App model to build tailored experiences that go further and provide more responsive, more distinct experiences based on the type of device on which they're running. Now, we've also done a lot of work in the application model and API space to provide uniformity across delivering these experiences. Now, in this release of Windows Phone 8.1 and Windows Desktop update, the update 1 to Windows 8.1, we have 90% API alignment across the Windows RT API surface area. And that means that when you're delivering business logic or leveraging core functionality of the device type, you can use a lot of the same code across both these solutions because of that fact. We've also converged on a single application model and lifecycle. And that means that when you build, and so this is work that had to take place in the operating system, in the platform of the operating system, about how the applications are actually running in the operating system. So that work was required, and you'll see here Windows Runtime. On top of the runtime, you can target that runtime using .NET languages, C# VB, or native languages, C and C++. And then we also have HTML and JavaScript programming model, WinJS being the set of UI class libraries in that instance. Question here, Universal Apps, is this for store apps only? Most customers don't use store apps but WPF desktop apps. Can you give specific information about WPF desktop apps? No, well, unfortunately, so we're not going to talk about WPF today. I'll be clear about that. This is about Windows Store apps and Windows Phone Store apps initially. We're doing a lot to break down the walls between Windows Runtime application development and Windows Desktop application development. That's the statement I want to make here. There was a little bit of this announced at Build. If you watch the Build keynote, we talked a little bit about how we now have the ability to enable applications written using the Windows Runtime in the Windows Store, having those access application functionality that you've delivered on the desktop previously. So there's a session from Build that also talks about this. But that's just the start, because we recognize and we believe that the division between these two universes is not necessary. And we want to maximize reuse of your code. We're extremely committed to protecting the investments that our developers have made in our programming models, different ones. And so we're going to be doing more here. And that's all I can say about that at this point. Today we'll be talking about the Store Universal App model. And you can imagine that a lot of these approaches will be applicable across these other offerings as time progresses. Nothing to announce, unfortunately. A question from Ryan Norbauer. What is the current best practice for syncing data between occasionally connected universal apps using Azure as a data hub? I'll get to that a little bit towards the end of the presentation. I'm not going to go deep in there, but we will follow up with some more references to more data. There's a ton of different options in this space. And you know, obviously Azure, it provides you an enormous amount of flexibility in terms of what you want to do here in creating a store for application data. But there are some lower end things that we're doing for absolutely for free, that without even using Azure at all. In Windows Phone 8.1 and in Windows 8.1 Update 1, you now get the ability to share application data, and it's provided absolutely free by the runtime. Using users OneDrive, and it's actually, it doesn't count against their quota on OneDrive, but everyone who logs in with their live ID, which they have to do in order to install store apps, their OneDrive will have a protected repository that they can't see, that we allow you to leverage as an application developer to store things like key value pairs. Not a lot of data, like around 100 kilobytes, but enough. And then there's roaming data, we call that, and we also have roaming settings. But we'll get to that a little bit later, because that's yet one more aspect of this whole puzzle. Delivering that single experience across multiple device types. That's what we're talking about when we talk about universal apps. So it's much, much more than any one aspect of this. And like I said here, universal user interface is a key part of it, app model, APIs, tools. We'll spend some time demonstrating this in a minute. You want to be able to have a very streamlined experience in tools. And you're familiar with how powerful Visual Studio is. Well, in this release of Visual Studio, Update 2, here, we now have the ability to create universal solution projects for store apps. And these universal solution projects allow you to centralize all of your shared code in a single shared project folder node. And then in that same solution, you'll have a Windows Phone platform-specific node and a Windows-specific node. And it's completely up to you how little or how much you want to make platform-specific. Depending on how you architect your application, there might be a lot. Or if otherwise, if you'd rather centralize everything, you don't need to share a lot. You don't need to have a lot of platform-specific code. There are just one or two little things that you do have to do, and I'll show you that when we get there. But in general, you don't have to. And so this is one of the biggest things we've done. In fact, when some people talk about universal apps, they are specifically thinking about this universal solution in Visual Studio. But again, like I said, it's much, much more than just that universal solution. Now, store. There's a huge store component to providing this uniform experience to the end user. And today, we continue to have two different stores, a store for Windows Phone and a store for Windows. And what we've done in this release is we've made this a little bit more simple for the end user, and it hinges on you as a developer making some decisions. If you decide you want to have that uniform experience, you're delivering a single experience across different device types, you can link your app across those two stores. Now, we've already done some alignment across the two stores. Right now, you only have to register once and pay once, and you get access to both stores. But what we now announced and released in the build time frame, with this ability for you to link apps across the two stores. And once you do that linking, you get a number of different types of benefits. First of all, for end users, they will see this icon. There's this icon in the middle here, and that indicates that this is an application that is linked across both stores. And if it's a paid app, the user who buys the app once on one platform will automatically get it for free on the other one. They'll have bought it on both because it's a single experience, is the notion. You can also, once you've linked apps, share in-app purchase content. So what that means is that if you've got in-app purchase items for one and people buy those, when they go on the other device, they will have them there as well. Obviously, this is all stuff that is no-brainer, it should be available, but a lot of work went into making this happen. We're going to continue to drive alignment here too. A couple more things here that you get with store alignment is that once you've linked the apps, they share a single notification channel. And that means that when you use push notifications in your application, you will now be able to have those notifications appear appropriately on both devices. And then the final thing is you get access to this shared data and shared settings. This free shared data, shared settings aspect of our API surface area that lets you get access to this for free in the background without having to think about programming against Azure. Question from Atul Kumar. Assumption that most of Uni apps will be web service driven thin local is correct. Not necessarily. We've seen a number of folks delivering game experiences that are almost completely local, which are not thin at all, as universal apps. So there's a wide spectrum of different types of experiences where people have a brand or an identity that is associated with this specific type of experience. Whether or not you actually don't have to do any code sharing to link apps across the two stores. So, conversely, you don't have to link across the two stores and have 100% code sharing. So these things can be implemented independently of each other. And that makes it a little bit more confusing, obviously, when we talk about universal apps, because you can completely share the code across these two solutions and not link them. Because, for example, if you wanted to charge different prices for, say, you have a tablet version that's much, much more enhanced, you may really legitimately want to charge more for that. And you can do that, but it will require that you not link those apps. And there are pros and cons to that approach, but the fact of the matter is that you are selling something that we consider a different experience when you've done that. And that's why that's the approach we've taken at this point. Question from Will. Any news to enable code obfuscation for universal apps? Well, there's absolutely no reason you can't use... so this will hinge a little bit on what you mean in terms of obfuscation. Obviously, obfuscation in the binary itself and encryption on device is something that is absolutely available. There's also the question with regard to transmission on the wire, and I don't actually know the answer to that one right now, about what the status is there. So I apologize, Will. We'll follow up with that question. I'm going to continue on here. So that's basically the layout of the land. And I just wanted to start out there by talking about this, just to summarize really quickly, and then I'll move on. We're going to start going into demos here. Just bear with me for a second. Once again, just to summarize, universal apps are not any one of these things. They are about delivering a unified experience across multiple device types with a minimum amount of work. And that's what we've tried to enable. And we've enabled that through work in a variety of different areas that aren't all required in order to deliver these experiences. You can pick and choose what you want to do here. You can share maximum amount of code. You can share no code and link, or you can, and these are solutions that are available now in Windows 8.1 Update 1 as well as Windows Phone 8.1. So you do have to start targeting these new platforms in order to take advantage of these. Now, Windows Phone 8.1, let me just say one more thing too. Obviously, this required us to change the user, for XAML, we had to move to the Windows XAML model. And so that means that when you build an application for Windows Phone 8.1 and you want to use a universal app, you have to build a Windows XAML application, as opposed to a Silverlight XAML app. You can still build Silverlight XAML apps. They just simply will not be able to take advantage of these universal solution types to share code. We also have full backwards compatibility. All the existing Windows Phone apps will absolutely run on Windows Phone 8.1. But in order to be able to get the maximum amount of code reuse, that means writing to Windows XAML with a Windows Phone 8.1 XAML project. And we'll look at what that looks like exactly in a minute. But I just wanted to be clear about that, because if you have an existing Windows Phone app, it's a Windows Phone 8 app, it's a Silverlight XAML, and it's a XAML app. It's a Silverlight XAML app. We didn't actually talk about it very much as a Silverlight XAML app. We stopped using the word Silverlight a little bit in Windows Phone 8 because it caused a lot of confusion for folks. Most people think about the web browser plugin when they think about Silverlight. And on Windows Phone, XAML C# programming was always it was always based on that Silverlight runtime. A version of the Silverlight runtime was brought to Phone back in Windows Phone 7, and then in Windows Phone 8 was refreshed. But this was based on Silverlight XAML with Silverlight runtime. And so it's just in Windows Phone 8.1, we knew we had to be able to clarify what we were talking about when we had one type of XAML app versus another. And so really the only thing that made sense was to call it what it was, which is a Silverlight XAML app versus a Windows XAML app. And certainly there's opportunity for lots more confusion there as well. But part of my goal here is to try to clarify these things and make it clear to folks what we're talking about. So you still can create, all your Silverlight XAML apps will continue to run. You can create new Silverlight XAML apps, Silverlight 8.1 XAML apps that leverage features and functionality of Windows Phone 8.1. But those will not get the benefit of being able to create universal solutions where you are actually maximizing code reuse. You can link, however. because linking apps across the two stores does not require that you have any code in common at all. Question from Merrick. Does Universal Window Apps concept also regard ActiveX games? ActiveX, I haven't heard that term in a long time. I assume you might mean DirectX. When we're talking about DirectX games, yes, you can write a universal app that is a native application using DirectX. Absolutely, absolutely, and I'll show you where that exists in the project templates when we get there. So let's move in and look at what Universal Windows App Solutions look like. This is where I'm going to focus a majority of the remaining time. And please feel free to submit questions. This is about you, and I want to provide you the answers that you can in this wonderful online conference. Here I am in Visual Studio 2013. This is Ultimate, but of course we also have the free Express SKU for Windows, and you can run either one. So you don't have to buy Ultimate by any means. Please don't get that idea. But if I go in here to File New, and I start a new project, I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like, because you may not know. So what we've got here, obviously the templates are sorted at a high level here by language. Today we're going to be looking at C# programming, and inside the Store App node, you'll see you now see three, as of Update 2, you now see three different nodes: Universal Apps, Windows Apps, and Windows Phone Apps. Now, you don't have to use C# to write a universal app. You can use Visual Basic. Visual Basic, like I said, store apps here, there is no universal app node, but there are ways to do this, and there's a series of blogs on that, and you can do that. And I don't know the reason why that is that way, but it is. The point I want to make is, if you are a VB programmer, you do still have access to this concept. And then also, if we go down here to C++, you'll see the Store App node, and you'll see here Universal Apps, Windows Apps, Windows Phone Apps, exactly the same. If you want to write a C++ app, that leverages this notion. And then also, finally, JavaScript, Store Apps, Universal Apps, Windows Phone Apps. So all those approaches can leverage this notion. Now, let me just quickly stop here and show in Windows Phone Apps. I want to show you a little bit about what this looks like, because some folks have been a little bit confused by this. I go in here and I see, your normal templates: blank app, hub app, pivot app, and they say Windows Phone here, and all the way down to, and some new test apps too as well. Highly encourage folks to test their applications. I've heard it helps with quality. I'm joking a little bit there. We do know that we haven't necessarily provided you the best guidance possible on test coverage of your application, but there are some project types here that really help, and there were a few sessions that build about this as well. Now, if I keep going down though, blank app again, Windows Phone Silverlight. This would be how you create a new Windows Phone application with Silverlight. A Silverlight 8.1 Windows Phone application would be to use these templates here. And once you selected that, you would get a further combo box option to choose if you wanted that application to target Windows Phone 8 or Windows Phone 8.1. Now, if you target Windows Phone 8.1, you get the added benefit of being able to access the new developer scenarios enabled by Windows Phone 8.1. However, you lose compatibility with Windows Phone 8, which means your application, once published, would not be available to phones that are running Windows Phone 8. It would only be available to phones running 8.1. So, we're in this period of time before everyone has 8.1 on their phones, and so we fully recognize that if you're developing applications right now, you may want to continue developing Windows Phone 8.0 Silverlight application, and that's why that option is available to you. But we hope that you're looking into 8.1, and in fact, with Universal Apps, it's really easy, because Windows 8.1 is out there on devices right now, and you can build a tablet or desktop or laptop application for Windows Store using all of the Windows Runtime APIs, and very easily extend that application to be a Windows Phone 8.1 app as well, with the shared app notion, which we'll go through here in a minute. So, Universal Apps. I see blank app, hub app, class library, and Windows runtime component. And I'll talk about all those in turn. Blank app, obviously completely blank, nothing there, all up to you. Hub app. Now, the hub control was introduced with Windows 8.1 on the client side, and we've now brought this to Windows Phone. For those of you coming from Windows Phone development, you may be familiar with the notion of what we called panorama. Well, you can think of the hub as the evolution of the panorama control. However, it now works on both device types, and it will render appropriately based on the device type that it's operating on. So you'll see here in the picture, you'll see here's a picture of a phone and a picture of a tablet, and that's simply to indicate this fact to you that the hub control is one of these controls that has this magic power. So I'm going to create a hub app, and we're just going to look at the pieces of that hub app really quickly before I go into demonstrating exactly how you would use this. Now I've opened up what I've got here. Let's zoom in a bit here, over here. And let's collapse stuff a bit here. So this is a universal solution. And it's got 3 projects in it by default. It's got a Windows 8.1 project, hubapp.windows, that's the default name because I called this hubapp 4. Hubapp4.windows phone, which is a Windows Phone 8.1 project. And then it has this new type of node called the shared node. And one thing you'll notice, they all go into this folder here, hubapp4. That folder is optional. You can actually remove that if you want. You don't need that. And let's look at here a little bit. That shared folder is a new type of import. So what we have here, and the way this operates, is this still compiles 2 different binaries. You compile a Windows app or a Windows Phone app. However, that app will automatically import all of the code that comes from the shared node. So let's go back out. That's a little hard to look at. Let's look here and I'll show you. If I look in references, you'll see now that the references for the Windows app has an import specified for that shared component, and then the phone version does as well. Here under references, you'll see the shared component. That new icon represents to you that that's the shared component. And what goes in each piece, right? So, this is just one way of laying it out. Obviously, when you architect your own application, you will make decisions around how you want to separate out shared content, code, assets, etc., from platform-specific content. This template does it one way, but that doesn't mean that's how you have to do it. In this template, you'll see here that the XAML pages for the project, section page, item page, and even the hub page are platform-specific. And you wouldn't have to do that. You don't have to do that at all. And we'll get to that in a minute. You could create shared XAML that constitutes the primary interface for your user interface. As long as you're using responsive design principles in XAML, you can create this UI and have it be shared. But the primary things that are very, obviously going to be shared, assets, these are just graphical assets. Those don't certainly need to, although in this case, other resources like images or videos or media, that's the sort of thing you would definitely put in a shared project. Here you'll notice, though, that we have some assets that are specifically called out in platform specific. Now, here's the reason for that. In Windows 8.1 and Windows Phone 8.1 now, we support this notion called, it's Modern Resource Technology, I think MRT is what it's called. It's a way of appropriately using an asset based on the actual display characteristics of the device. It's something that's pretty important to understand once you start getting into the complexity of targeting multiple display resolution. But the point here is that there are certain scale ratios that are applicable only to one or the other. So like here under Windows 8.1, you'll see 100, and then here under Windows Phone, you'll see 240 as the default. And those are the 2 defaults. And the point is that these assets can get very large in size, and so it may very well be the case that you want to make that platform specific so that the ones that are only applicable to phone don't appear in the Windows project, and the ones that are only applicable to Windows don't appear in the phone project. A couple questions here I've missed, actually, and I'll start with the second one because I can't read the first one. It's scrolled off a little. The first one appears to be about automating functional testing of the UI, and I don't know the answer to that. I would suspect anything you can do with VS in terms of automating testing would be equally applicable to a universal app, because the build system is simply compiling the runtime to be a project like any other project, and so I wouldn't see any reason why it wouldn't necessarily be automatable as is anything else, but we will have to follow up on that one. Second question here, Golden Joe. Users don't like to wait. They expect mobile apps to start up instantly. So why did MS enable splash screens? And then I can't see the very bottom of that one. But why did we enable splash screens by default? Great question. I've talked to a lot of developers who have told me that the splash screen is a sign of failure. That if you're using a splash screen, you have automatically, failed in your goal as a developer to create performant experiences. This is a philosophical question that I will have to ask the appropriate people about why we enabled splash screens by default, but we do have splash screens by default. Don't know the answer, Golden Joe. Okay, let's continue on here. So we're looking at our Hub app template. I'm not going to spend too much more time here because we're running low on time. But the main thing I wanted to show here is that we've got these assets. We've got some of this common material here, like navigation helper. The navigation model is shared across both. These are these are actually helper code that we put in these template files. You don't get them in the blank template, but if you add a page item to a blank template, you get these. Navigation helper, observable dictionary, relay command, and suspension manager. These all help you managing the lifecycle and navigation of your application, and they both work for both Windows and Windows Phone. Great helper code that I would recommend people use. If you follow through the templates, you can get more information about how those work. Data model here, sample data is being shared, as well as some of the data model around what the data source looks like, the object, the shape of the objects, strings, these are resources. So when you're localizing your application, you can share those resources across both. And then here, app.xaml, that's the application object, obviously, is going to be shared across both because we've moved to this unified approach. But you can share all sorts of other types of UI here. Like I said, one of the models we think people will likely take is to create user controls that adapt appropriately, or even full pages. You can use the hub control as a shared component. You can use a normal page as a shared component. You simply have to make sure you are using good responsive design principles. And the other thing that I want to note here is that using a logic presentation separation approach such as MVVM is absolutely desirable in this new world, because if you are separating out presentation from logic, it makes it much, much easier for you as a developer to create presentations that are appropriate for the specific device type and go as far as you want with that appropriate design. And so, of course, a model like MVVM is very appropriate to take in terms of having great separation of code and logic. One more thing I want to talk about here, just real quick. You know how we have code behind in XAML, obviously? A page will have, and I'll just show you code behind the page here really quick. One of the great things that we did, and I don't know if people were thinking ahead or what, just in terms of creating these pages, if you look at the classes, and I'm not actually certain if these are going to show it here, but if you look at the default, what you can do is use the partial keyword to create partial classes. And the great benefit here is that you can actually share code behind. You could have a XAML page be platform specific, but all the code behind could be shared. And that's really a fantastic option. The partial class makes this real easy to do, because all you have to do is leverage a partial class in each of those pages, and then that means that you've actually been able to just segment out all that logic from the page. I have 5 minutes left. Wow. Wow, we didn't even get to the primary demo, but I've been wanting to answer your questions, so hopefully this has been useful. Question, Vishal S. How the images and apps will scale to different devices revolutions. Developer need to take care of it. So MRT is the magic here. We have this approach, and it's too complex to go into in 5 minutes. I did a great session of Inside Windows Phone with Peter Torr where we talked about a little bit. You have to provide appropriate assets. You don't have to, well, you don't have to, actually. You can choose to allow the presentation, the actual runtime to handle scaling of the image, and that will work. But you may want to include appropriate images with appropriate resolutions based on the device type that you're targeting to create a better experience. And that's where the extra work gets into it. And one feature that helps with this, and I'm just going to show this really quick because I was going to show it anyway. If you look at the XAML designer page, and that's in Windows. Oh, let me show you a couple other things here. When you're in And I don't have a page here to show that. But when you're in a code page here, we now have a context switcher that allows you to switch. If it's in a shared project, it allows you to show you the context. And one of the things we anticipate people are going to be doing is if-defing code in shared projects for certain situations where they need to have conditional code based on project type. And there's a couple different instances where that's required. One is the hardware back button on phone. The hardware back button on phone doesn't exist on tablets. And so instances where you are wiring up the hardware back button to work, you're going to need, and this is done by default in the templates, but if you need to, you'll want to if-def that code in shared code because obviously it's not available on a tablet. And then there are a couple of UI notions on tablet that don't exist on phone. And we give you new symbols for this if-defing. So if you look at the properties on the build properties on the project type, you'll see here Windows app is now defined. And so similarly on the Windows Phone project, we're defining a symbol for Windows Phone app. And so you can if-def based on that, and you go, if Windows Phone app, then you run this code and end if, and that's how you handle that type of situation. I've got an example of that. Let's see, here's the actual universal app I wanted to show. This is a Windows 8.1 app, and I'm just really quick. We have a Windows 8.1 app here, and what you can do with any existing Windows 8.1 app is you can right-click and say, Add Windows Phone 8.1. And this is a way that you can convert an existing project into a universal project. And what that does is that adds the Windows Phone version and a shared node. And then you can go ahead and move all of the content that you want to have be universal into the universal project. Instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to launch the version where it's already done because we don't have time, unfortunately. And let's look at it here and see what it looks like, because what we've done here, you'll notice there is still UI here. We didn't do the UI work, but we did move all the logic out of the actual individual nodes into here. So we have common data model, images and strings, resources, and a section user control that we moved into shared. And if I look at certain things like the navigation helper, you'll notice we had to make a few modifications here to if-def a couple pieces of code here based on if it's a Windows Phone app. This is wiring up the back button. So you'll look, if I change my context to Windows, you'll see it's grayed out. And so that's a very quick and easy way to see which type of project you're working on. This context switcher, it's available in Blend, it's on the device panel, but because Blend has full support for universal projects now as well. And that's really great because in Blend, if you're familiar with visual states are an amazing mechanism that you can use to easily define device-specific UI based on the target that you're running on. And that enables you to create, you can create a variety of states based on, basically you can key off of how your XAML is rendering and run a specific visual state and then just show the appropriate UI. So this makes it very easy to create responsive designs that change based on the resolution available. And Peter Torr talks about this in depth, and again, that same Inside Windows Phone session I was talking about. So let me just wrap up here because we're at noon, and I apologize, folks. But I want to give you a quick, there's a couple other things I wanted to talk about here. Obviously, separation of concerns is a important notion to leverage. UI can be in either of the projects if you want to, but you can also, in logic in the shared project, that's the most obvious way to start, but it's it's not hard to do shared UI. I would highly encourage people to think about that. Class inheritance is another way to do this if you wanted to have a base class in the shared library and then have inherited subclasses that are platform specific. Another thing you can do is partial classes I talked about, or methods. That's a very easy way to take code behind and just drop it in the shared project. There's an example of what that would look like. Roaming data, I talked about this very briefly. There's a whole session on this at Build I highly recommend you take a look at. Clearly, this is a key part about delivering that unified experience. And you can use this for settings or for data. Not a lot of data, like around 100K. OneDrive can be used if you need to do more. And then there were a bunch of XAML authoring enhancements, but Tim Hewer is going to talk about that later on. So I hope I answered most of your questions. I hope that this was a useful time for you. I'm not sure who's coming up next, but we do have plenty more for you today at the exciting .NET conference. So it was a real pleasure to talk to you today, and have a good time.